Welcome to Mr. Creepingville, where reality and the paranormal collide. Tonight, we unveil a collection of unsettling real-life experiences, moments where the unseen made its presence known. These are not tales or stories, but true encounters with the inexplicable. From eerie laughter in the darkness to the lingering presence of unseen friends, each experience will leave you questioning what hides beyond the veil. If you're captivated by the macabre, fascinated by the unknown, or simply daring enough to look into the shadows, be sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with others who crave the chills, and like the video to support us in uncovering more of the unexplainable. Turn off the lights, brace yourself, and remember, some things can't be unseen. When my daughter was just a baby, the kind of age where she could stand and climb but hadn't quite started talking yet, we lived in a small, cozy house by an old cemetery. It wasn't just any graveyard, it was the kind that seemed to carry a heavy silence even in the brightest daylight. Time had worn it down, leaving behind faded headstones, unmarked mounds, and tiny graves that made your heart ache if you looked too long. The children's graves were especially haunting. Small stone markers stood solemnly, most of them blank, weathered down by years of rain and wind. Others bore faint carvings of dates, short lifespans frozen in stone. The graves sat under the shadow of gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. Our daughter, barely steady on her feet, had a peculiar fascination with the cemetery. It was uncanny. On most days, she loved to stand by the window that overlooked the graveyard. She'd press her tiny hands against the glass, her chubby cheeks squished as she giggled and waved. But here's the thing, there was nothing there. At first, my wife and I brushed it off as baby behavior. Maybe she liked the way the wind rustled the leaves or how the shadows danced over the mounds. But her focus was unsettling. She wasn't looking at the trees or the stones. Her eyes seemed fixed on something, someone invisible to us. And it wasn't just the window. When we took her out onto the deck, she'd toddle straight to the side facing the cemetery. She'd stand there, jabbering in her baby babble, waving and laughing as though in conversation with a group of unseen friends. It was cute for a while. Babies do strange things, after all. But as the weeks went by, her behavior became odd. She wasn't just laughing or waving anymore. She'd sit on the deck, her eyes following something that wasn't there. Sometimes, she'd reach out, her little fingers curling and uncurling as if trying to grasp a hand extended toward her. Other times, she'd stop mid-babble, tilting her head like she was listening intently to something or someone we couldn't hear. One evening, my wife and I decided to watch her more closely. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air felt heavy and the sky glowed orange as the sun set. We had just finished dinner and brought her outside to play on the deck. As usual, she made a beeline for the side facing the cemetery. She plopped herself down and stared intently at the graveyard, her lips moving silently as though carrying on a conversation. "What do you think she's doing?" my wife whispered, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the unease in her voice. "I don't know," I admitted, leaning against the railing. "Maybe she's just imagining things?" My wife nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Neither was I. Then, our daughter did something that sent chills racing down my spine. She stood up suddenly, her tiny frame wobbly but determined, and reached out with both arms. Her face lit up with a wide, joyful smile, the kind of smile she usually reserved for us when we picked her up. "Who are you reaching for, sweetheart?" my wife asked, her voice trembling. Our daughter turned to look at us, her big, innocent eyes shining in the dim light. "Friend," she said, her first words spoken so clearly it froze us in place. "Friend?" I echoed, stepping closer. "What friend?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the cemetery, her tiny hands still outstretched. A cold wind blew through the air, rattling the leaves and making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. That night, neither of us could sleep. We lay in bed, the image of her standing there, reaching out to the darkness, burned into our minds. My wife tried to rationalize it. "She's just a baby," she said, her voice shaky. She doesn't know what she's saying. Maybe she heard us talking about friends or something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an intensity in her actions, a focus that didn't feel like random baby behavior. It felt deliberate. The following days only made things worse. Every time we brought her to the deck, she'd go straight to her spot and resume her strange interactions. Sometimes she'd giggle uncontrollably, other times she'd just sit there, staring silently for what felt like hours. Once, she even began crying, reaching out desperately as though someone was walking away from her. We decided to keep her inside after that. But even then, she found her way to the window, her tiny fingers tapping against the glass as she waved and smiled at whatever or whoever was out there. One night, as we sat in the living room trying to distract ourselves with a movie, we heard her laughing from her room. It wasn't unusual for her to laugh in her sleep, but this time it was different. The laughter was louder, more animated, as though she were wide awake and playing. I got up to check on her, my heart pounding as I climbed the stairs. Her door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I froze. She was standing in her crib, her little hands gripping the wooden railing as she laughed and pointed toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the pale light of the moon seeped through, casting eerie shadows on the floor. "Sweetheart?" I said softly, stepping into the room. "What's so funny?" She turned to me, her face glowing with happiness. "Friend," she said again, pointing at the window. I pulled back the curtains, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But there was nothing. Just the cemetery, its headstones gleaming faintly under the moonlight. "Time for bed, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I picked her up and held her close, her tiny body warm and comforting against my chest. But as I turned to lay her back down, I caught a glimpse of something outside, a shadow, darker than the night, moving swiftly between the graves. My breath caught in my throat, and I hurriedly closed the curtains, pretending I hadn't seen anything. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window in our bedroom, staring out at the cemetery, my eyes straining to catch any sign of movement. The hours dragged on, the silence of the house broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hoot of an owl. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off, I heard it, a faint, melodic humming drifting in through the walls. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the cemetery. The next morning, my wife and I decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed our things and moved within a week, leaving behind the graveyard and its silent occupants. Our daughter stopped waving and laughing at invisible friends after that, and life returned to normal. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that little house by the cemetery. About the tiny graves and the unmarked mounds. About the shadow I saw and the humming I heard. And I wonder, who was my daughter waving at? And why did they seem so happy to see her? We were driving on a quiet road one evening, my wife and I, with our 3-year-old son strapped snugly in his car seat in the back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched and swayed as we moved. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, except for the occasional hum of passing cars and the gentle rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. The road led us past a cemetery, a sprawling expanse of stone markers and neatly trimmed grass. It wasn't unusual for us to pass by, but tonight, something felt different. The cemetery seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. I didn't pay it much mind, chalking it up to the eerie light of the dusk. As we slowed to a stop at a red light near the cemetery, my son, who had been quietly gazing out the window, suddenly spoke. His voice was soft, almost distant, but it cut through the quiet like a knife. "There are people laying down there," he said, his small finger pointing toward the rows of headstones. "And they can't get up." My wife and I exchanged a quick glance, her eyes mirroring the unease I felt creeping up my spine. "What did you say, sweetheart?" my wife asked, turning slightly to look at him. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tension that only I could detect. My son kept staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the cemetery. "The people in the park," he repeated, his tone matter of fact, as though he were explaining something perfectly obvious. "They're stuck. They can't get up." The word "stuck" hung in the air, heavy and cold. My wife and I sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the idling engine the only sound between us. "What people?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, knuckles turning white. "The ones lying down," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "They're calling for help, but no one hears them." A chill ran down my spine. My wife turned to me, her face pale. We had never spoken about death to our son. At 3 years old, he hadn't experienced loss or even seen a cemetery up close. Yet, there he was, speaking about it with an unsettling clarity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Who's calling for help, honey?" my wife asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to sound reassuring, but I could tell she was just as unnerved as I was. "The people on the ground," he said simply. "They want to get up, but they can't. They're stuck under the dirt." I glanced at the cemetery, half expecting to see something, anything that could explain his words. But it was just the same rows of headstones, silent and still. Yet, it didn't feel empty. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, colder. I could feel a knot forming in my stomach, a primal fear I couldn't quite shake. "Maybe he overheard something on TV," I whispered to my wife, trying to rationalize it, to convince myself that there was a simple explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. We were careful about what we let him watch, and even then, nothing like this had ever come up. My wife nodded, but her expression didn't change. "Maybe," she said, though her tone was unconvincing. She turned back to our son. "What else do you see, sweetheart?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze remained locked on the cemetery, his little face eerily calm. Then, he tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something we couldn't hear. "They're sad," he said finally. "They want to go home, but they don't know how." A shiver coursed through me. I pressed the gas pedal lightly, eager for the light to change. The cemetery seemed to loom larger in the rearview mirror as we drove away, its presence lingering even after it was out of sight. At home that night, we tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just a child's imagination. But neither of us could shake the unease that lingered. My wife tucked our son into bed, kissing his forehead and whispering a soft goodnight. I stood in the doorway, watching as he drifted off to sleep, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of dreams. When we were finally alone, I turned to my wife. "Do you think he really saw something?" I asked, my voice low. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I don't know what it was," she admitted, "but it didn't feel normal." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the evening pressing down on us. Outside, the wind howled softly, and the shadows seemed to stretch and flicker in the dim light of the room. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the memory of that night lingered. I found myself glancing at my son more often, watching for any signs that he might say something else, something that would explain what had happened. But he didn't. He was just his usual cheerful self, playing with his toys and laughing as though nothing had happened. Then, a week later, it happened again. We were driving past the same cemetery, this time in the early afternoon. The sun was bright, and the world seemed alive and vibrant. My wife and I were chatting casually, the radio playing softly in the background. My son was quiet in the back, staring out the window as he often did. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice cutting through the lighthearted atmosphere like a knife. "They're still there," he said. I felt my heart skip a beat. My wife turned to look at him, her face instantly serious. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked. "The people," he said, pointing to the cemetery again. "They're still stuck." "Why are they stuck?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, considering the question. "They said it's too dark," he replied. "They can't find the way out." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to say, and neither did my wife. We drove in silence for the rest of the way home, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The people, the darkness, the way out. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What had he seen? What had he heard? And why did it feel so real? I don't have the answers, even now. My son never mentioned the cemetery again, and we never asked. But every time we drive past it, I feel a shiver run down my spine, and I can't help but glance over, half expecting to see something I know I never will. Some things, I've come to realize, are better left unexplained. The search for a Halloween costume that year began like any other, with my mom and I venturing out to find something perfect for me to wear to school. For most kids, picking a costume might just be a fun outing, but for me, it was something much bigger. You see, I had been homeschooled for most of my life, and this was one of my first real chances to fit in with other kids at public school. Halloween at school was a huge deal, and I wanted to blend in. No, more than that, I wanted to stand out in a good way. Something cool, something that would make the other kids look at me and think, wow, he belongs here. We spent hours combing through store after store, my excitement slowly giving way to frustration. Nothing felt right. Every costume I found was either too silly, too plain, or just not me. The sky outside started to darken as the day slipped away, and my mom gently reminded me that we needed to find something soon and head home. We were down to our last shot, a strange Halloween costume store that had been around for as long as I could remember. It was one of those places that always seemed out of place, open year-round even though hardly anyone ever seemed to go there. Desperate, we decided to give it a try. We pulled up to the store as the last rays of sunlight faded, the sky turning a deep shade of purple. The building itself looked ancient, its faded sign creaking in the wind. The windows were grimy, streaked with smudges that obscured whatever might be inside. Something about it already felt wrong, but I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, this was my last chance to find a costume, and I wasn't about to let a spooky-looking store ruin that for me. My mom and I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet as we approached the door. The faint scent of mildew and something metallic hung in the air. I glanced at my mom. She smiled reassuringly, though there was a tightness around her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. She pushed the door open, and the bell above it gave a hollow, echoing chime that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness that made it hard to breathe. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, like stepping into a freezer. The dim yellow lighting flickered faintly, casting strange, shifting shadows across the shelves. The smell inside was stronger, a mix of decay and something chemical that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't just the sights or smells that unsettled me, it was the feeling. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, so intense that my chest tightened and my skin prickled as if every hair on my body was standing on end. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something darker, heavier. It felt like pure, unfiltered hatred directed squarely at me. I froze in place, my small third-grade self unable to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. It was as if the store itself was alive, and it didn't want me there. The pressure was almost physical, pushing down on me, making me feel small and vulnerable. I turned to look at my mom, and at the same moment, she turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the same fear I was feeling. We didn't say a word to each other. We didn't have to. In unspoken agreement, we turned on our heels and walked out, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty store. The moment we stepped back outside, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The air was still cold, but it was normal cold, not the oppressive chill from inside. We hurried back to the car, neither of us speaking until we were safely inside with the doors locked. I looked at my mom, my voice shaking as I asked, "Did you feel that too?" She nodded slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt evil. We sat there for a moment in silence, the darkness outside pressing in around us. Then my mom suggested we pray, and so we did, holding hands and asking for protection as she started the car and drove away. Even as we left the store far behind, the oppressive feeling lingered, a heavy knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the store. The oppressive hatred I'd felt inside wasn't something I could easily forget. It wasn't just fear, it was as if the store itself was alive, aware, and angry that we had dared to step inside. Even now, as an adult, the memory sends chills down my spine. I still don't know what we walked into that night, and maybe I never will. But I do know that whatever it was, it wanted us gone. We drove home in silence, the memory of that oppressive force clinging to us like a shadow. Even as we reached the familiar safety of our house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we brought something back with us. My mom seemed shaken too, her usual comforting presence subdued. But she didn't let it show for long. Determined to make sure I had a costume, she pulled out a box of old clothes and got to work. "Let's make something amazing," she said, her voice firm and steady, as if she were willing the fear to fade away through sheer determination. Together, we crafted a cowboy costume from things we had around the house. My grandpa's old cowboy hat, a pair of boots that had been gathering dust in the closet, and a plaid shirt that we tore a little to make it look rugged. My mom even found an old red bandana to tie around my neck and used a brown paper bag to fashion a makeshift vest, cutting fringe into it to give it an authentic look. As we worked, the fear began to ebb, replaced by a sense of warmth and safety. My mom hummed softly, and for the first time that evening, I felt like everything might be okay. By the time we were done, the cowboy costume looked better than anything we could have bought in a store. It wasn't just a costume, it was a labor of love, a reminder that even in the face of something unexplainable and terrifying, we could create something good. The next day, I wore the costume to school with pride. The other kids loved it, and for a moment, I felt like I truly belonged. But the memory of that store still lingered, a dark cloud at the edge of my thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd ventured further into the shadows of that eerie place. The questions haunted me for years, but I never found the courage to go back and look for answers. Even now, as an adult, I can't walk past a Halloween store without feeling a twinge of unease. I avoid the ones that seem out of place, the ones that stay open long after the season is over. Some part of me wonders if they're connected, if there are other places like that store out there waiting for someone unsuspecting to wander in. It's a chilling thought, one that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end even now. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that night and the oppressive force we felt inside the store. Was it a ghost? A curse? Something darker? I'll probably never know. But I do know one thing for certain, I'll never ignore my instincts again. Whatever was in that store, it wasn't meant for us or anyone else. The experience has stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we can see or explain. Sometimes they're the things we feel deep in our bones, the things that defy logic and reason. My mom and I never spoke much about that night after it happened, but every so often I'll catch her looking at me with a knowing expression as if she's thinking about it too. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually around Halloween when the memories feel especially vivid. Some people believe me, others don't. But that's okay. I know what I felt that night, and I know my mom felt it too. It was real as the warmth of her hand in mine when we prayed in the car, as real as the sound of the gravel crunching underfoot as we left the cursed place behind. To this day, the memory of that store is a mystery I'll never solve. But maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to remind us that the world is bigger and stranger than we can ever truly understand. And maybe, just maybe, they're meant to teach us to trust the things we can't see, the instincts that tell us when to walk away, no matter how curious we might be. When I was little, my room was my sanctuary. My dresser, a heavy, old wooden piece, sat against the wall with one end pointed toward my door. It was a sturdy piece of furniture adorned with all sorts of kid treasures, glass figurines, books, and random trinkets neatly arranged on top. The floor was carpeted, and I always slept with the door closed. It was my little world, safe and secure. Or so I thought. One particular night, something happened that would stay with me forever, haunting the edges of my memory like a shadow that refuses to fade. I had gone to bed as usual, the room quiet and still. The soft hum of the night outside filtered in through the closed window, and I drifted off to sleep, cocooned in the familiar comfort of my blankets. Hours later, I woke abruptly. Something was wrong. My heart was pounding, and the air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. At first, I couldn't place what had disturbed me. Then I noticed it, the silence. The usual night sounds were gone. No creaking of the house, no distant hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I lay there, frozen, my eyes adjusting to the dark. My dresser loomed in its usual spot, a solid and reassuring silhouette against the wall. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of footsteps, but it was coming from inside my room. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, more distinct, and my stomach clenched as I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was coming from my bed. The sound of springs compressing, as if someone, or something, was jumping on it. Panic surged through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from what I desperately hoped was just a bad dream. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate. I wanted to scream for my mom, but fear held me in place, my throat tight and dry. Then, with a loud crash, the noise stopped. I opened my eyes, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My dresser, that heavy, unmovable piece of furniture, had tipped over. But it hadn't fallen forward, as gravity would dictate. It had fallen sideways, perfectly blocking my bedroom door. All the items on top, my glass figurines, books, and toys, were scattered across the floor, but eerily, nothing was broken. I scrambled out of bed, my legs trembling as I moved toward the dresser. I tried to push it upright, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear my mom on the other side of the door, her voice panicked as she called my name. "Are you okay? What happened? Why won't the door open?" "I'm fine," I managed to choke out, my voice shaking. "The dresser, it fell. It's blocking the door." There was a pause, then the sound of her trying to push the door open. "I can't move it," she said, her voice strained. "Help me." I grabbed the edge of the dresser and pulled with all my might. Slowly, inch by inch, we managed to create a small gap, just enough for her to squeeze through. She rushed into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Together, we moved the dresser back into place, the heavy wood groaning in protest. Once it was upright, my mom turned to me, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, brushing my hair back from my face. I nodded, too shaken to say much. She glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the scattered items, and then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "I thought I heard you jumping on the bed," she said softly. "That's why I came to check on you." "But you were asleep, weren't you?" I nodded again, my throat too dry to speak. The thought of her hearing those noises, the ones I'd been too afraid to acknowledge, made my skin crawl. We didn't say much else that night. She stayed with me until I fell asleep, her presence a small comfort in the unsettling aftermath of what had happened. The next day, my dad helped us put the dresser back into place, securing it to the wall this time. We chalked the incident up to an unexplained fluke and moved on, or at least that's what we told ourselves. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had occurred that night. Years later, the memory resurfaced, as vivid and chilling as ever. I asked my mom about it, expecting her to dismiss it or explain it away. But instead, she confirmed every detail. The dresser falling sideways, the strange noises she'd heard, the way the items had scattered without breaking. Her account matched mine exactly, and she still couldn't explain it. Even now, as an adult, the memory lingers, a dark and unexplainable mark on my childhood. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. Whatever it wasn't just the dresser falling. It was something more, something that still makes my heart race and my skin crawl every time I think about it. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The rhythmic thumping, the impossible fall of the dresser, the oppressive silence that seemed to envelop the room. It's a puzzle I'll never solve, a mystery that will haunt me forever. And though I've tried to forget, the memory refuses to fade, a chilling reminder that some things simply can't be explained. It was a humid summer night, and the world outside was shrouded in a cloak of silence. Crickets chirped in the distance, a gentle hum blending with the occasional rustle of leaves. My parents were sitting out on the back porch, savoring the stillness. The warm breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers, and the moonlight spilled through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As they sat, sipping their drinks and exchanging quiet conversation, my mom suddenly froze. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a pale, person-sized figure. It was translucent, like a wisp of smoke, and it floated soundlessly past a large tree at the edge of the yard. She turned her head sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. My dad, a man not easily shaken, was already staring at the same spot, his face pale. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice uncharacteristically tight. "I saw it." The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that seemed to devour all other sounds. The air felt colder now, heavy and oppressive. They sat in silence for a moment, their eyes darting around the yard, but there was nothing else to see. Without another word, they went inside, locking the door behind them. My mom's hands trembled as she turned the lock. The next morning, as sunlight bathed the yard in a golden glow, the events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike. My mom decided to investigate. She walked out to the tree where they had seen the figure, her eyes scanning the ground. That's when she saw it, an earring. It was old, impossibly old, and weathered with time. The delicate filigree was tarnished, and a single, cloudy gemstone sat in its center. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. In fact, it looked like it had belonged to someone from another century. She picked it up gingerly, her stomach twisting into knots. The earring felt ice cold, and the sensation lingered on her skin even after she placed it in her palm. She carried it inside, placed it in her jewelry box, and tried to push the whole thing out of her mind. But the earring didn't stay in the jewelry box. The very next day, it was found lying in the middle of the basement floor. My mom was the first to see it, and her blood ran cold. She called my dad down to look. He frowned, his brows knitting together as he studied the object. "How did it get here?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer because she didn't know. She put the earring back in her jewelry box, this time closing the lid with a snap. That night, I began to notice things. The first time, it was subtle. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, footsteps. They were faint, like someone was walking barefoot down the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought it was one of my parents, but when I opened the door to check, the hall was empty. My pulse quickened, and I told myself it was just my imagination. But the footsteps didn't stop. Every few nights, I'd hear them again. Sometimes they were slow and deliberate, other times quick, as if someone was rushing past my door. Then came the whispers. They were faint, almost inaudible, but they were there. They sounded like a conversation, just out of earshot. I'd strain to listen, my heart thudding in my chest, but I could never make out the words. The atmosphere in the house changed. Shadows seemed darker, stretching unnaturally long across the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension. I began to dread the nights, lying awake for hours, waiting for the inevitable sounds to start. My parents noticed my unease, but didn't say much. They were uneasy themselves, though they tried to hide it. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder. They were right outside my door, a hissing chorus of unintelligible words. My skin prickled, and my breath caught in my throat. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to retreat, fading into the walls. I turned on every light in my room and sat in the corner, hugging my knees to my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. Weeks turned into months, and the occurrences continued. Sometimes, objects would move on their own. A book would fall off a shelf. A glass of water would slide across the table. The earring, no matter where my mom placed it, always found its way back to the basement floor. My parents started avoiding the basement altogether. The air down there felt different, colder, and filled with a malevolent energy. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me. My room was dark, but the shadows seemed alive, shifting and pulsing. I turned on the bedside lamp, and that's when I saw it, the figure from the yard. It was standing at the foot of my bed, its form barely visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, piercing and cold. I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear, my mind screaming at me to run. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, an oppressive presence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. My mom's face went pale, and my dad's jaw tightened. We didn't speak of it again, but the decision was made. It was time to leave. Within weeks, we had packed up and moved out of the house. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. The memory of that summer still haunts me, a dark stain on otherwise ordinary life. Sometimes, I wonder about the earring. Did it belong to the figure we saw? Was it some kind of anchor, tying them to this world? I'll never know. We left the earring behind when we moved, buried in the basement where it belonged. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. The memory of the house lingered like a shadow on my soul. Over the years, I couldn't help but replay every moment, every sound, every chilling encounter. My parents' silence on the matter only added to the weight. Whenever I brought it up, my mom would change the subject, her fingers fidgeting nervously. My dad would give me a look that said, "Let it go." But I couldn't. I started to research the history of the house, determined to uncover its secrets. Old town records revealed that the land had once belonged to a reclusive woman named Eleanor Whitaker. She had lived there over a century ago and was known for her peculiar behavior. Some said she was a witch, others claimed she was just a lonely soul who kept to herself. Her death was as mysterious as her life. The records stated she had vanished one stormy night, leaving behind only a single piece of jewelry, an earring, said to be cursed. The discovery sent chills down my spine. Could it be the same earring my mom had found? The connection was too strong to ignore. I shared my findings with my parents, but they dismissed it, insisting it was all coincidence. Still, the unease in their eyes betrayed their words. As the years passed, I tried to forget, but the whispers never truly left me. They would come in the dead of night, faint and fleeting, as if carried on the wind. No matter where I was, I felt their presence, a reminder of what I had experienced. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find objects in my room slightly moved, as though unseen hands had been at work. One night, I dreamed of the house. It was exactly as I remembered, down to the smallest detail. In the dream, I was walking through the rooms, the air thick with tension. When I reached the basement, I saw the earring lying on the floor, glowing faintly. A voice whispered my name, soft and mournful. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream marked the beginning of a new phase. The occurrences became more frequent, more intense. Shadows seemed to follow me, stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. Electronic devices would flicker and malfunction when I was near. The feeling of being watched was constant, a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I decided to visit the house again, against my better judgment. It had been years since we'd moved out, and the property had been sold to a new family. I drove by one evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The house looked the same, but it felt different, as though it was waiting for me. I didn't stop. I couldn't bring myself to. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time, the figure stood at the edge of the yard, its translucent form illuminated by the moonlight. It raised an arm, pointing toward the basement. I woke up with a start, the message clear. It wanted me to go back. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, I returned to the house the next night. The new owners were away, the windows dark. I crept into the yard, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When I reached the basement window, I saw it, the earring, lying in the exact spot my mom had found it. The air grew colder, the silence deafening. My breath fogged in front of me as I reached for the earring. The moment I touched it, a wave of emotions washed over me, sadness, anger, longing. A voice whispered in my ear, faint but unmistakable, "Help me." The experience left me shaken. I placed the earring back where I found it and fled. That night, the whispers stopped. For the first time in years, I felt at peace, as though the spirit had finally found rest. Or so I thought. Days later, I found the earring on my bedroom dresser, glinting in the morning light. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. The whispers continue, a haunting melody that follows me wherever I go. The earring sits in a locked box, hidden away, but I know it's only a matter of time before it finds its way back. The figure, the whispers, the shadows, they are all part of a story that refuses to end. And perhaps it never will.